Hi, my name is Kelly Panetta, and I am going to be talking about Valley Forge and why this was the darkest time during the American Revolution. Um, when a lot of people ask the question, what was Valley Forge? Many people just immediately think about it as being a turning point in our Revolutionary War. Um, what a lot of people don't do is they don't focus or look at the details of what happened, look at what these men, these soldiers, George Washington, what they had to go through in order to get to that turning point. And everything that they went through that led them there was Valley Forge. This was a place that George Washington took these troops to in order to, he took them there for safety after experiencing multiple battle losses against the British. And so he marched them to Valley Forge. And it was a 20-mile march, which doesn't seem that far, but for these men who were exhausted, tired, worn out, injured, sick, it was a long walk. Um, the people that were affected by Valley Forge, the people that had to live through Valley Forge, weren't just soldiers, but they were George Washington and his wife, um, soldiers under his command, those soldiers' families, some of their children. Other people came in to help them. They had a baker at one point show up to cook for them. It was more than just these men and George Washington that had to go through Valley Forge, it was others as well. And so their arrival to Valley Forge was not what they expected. They arrived, they were extremely weak, they were exhausted, they were hungry and tired and beaten down, and they marched all the way there not wearing the proper clothing. They didn't have proper shoes on. There are images that you can look up, and they are portraying these men with bare feet. They're bloody, they're injured. They get there and there's no shelter. They realize they have to build everything from nothing. And they built about 2,000 log huts, which seems like a lot, but there was only 12,000, but there were 12,000 soldiers. So for that many soldiers, 2,000 log huts is not much, and those huts were not large. And they also had to house about 400 women and children that were with them. Washington was nearby. He stayed in Isaac Potts' home, which is now a historic attraction available to the public. They had to build all this with very little supplies. They did not have anything with them to build huts. They made what they used what they could to make these, which makes it even more impressive because they built everything absolutely out of nothing. They had no bedding, they had no blankets, they had no socks, nothing to help them keep warm. So they went out and they got straw, they got any items from the outdoors that they can use to help themselves get through this harsh weather. Um, they even built their own roads and trenches. And if you read about it, it's said that they pretty much created for themselves this little city. Um, Another main issue that they looked at was a lack of food. After they arrived to Valley Forge, they immediately realized that they were running low on water, they were running low on food. The state had a system for providing food to soldiers, but even that didn't come through for them. And during this time in history, if they did not have enough to go around, then they simply just didn't send it. So these men were pretty much out of luck and had to understand and endure just the fact that they weren't going to have this food coming in. And the food that they did have was very little. And then they also just had to eat things that weren't good. They were not appetizing, but it kept them alive, so they did it. And so starvation and thirst was a big factor in Valley Forge. Um, it is something that these men had to go through. But despite all of that, that was still not the biggest killer at Valley Forge. A lot of people think the cold weather and the starvation is what killed these men, but really disease was a huge factor that came into play. It killed a lot of men, and there were diseases like influenza, typhoid fever, dysentery. These were all things that were increased by poor hygiene, poor living conditions, and we know that these men had no choice but to live in those conditions. And it is said that about 2,000 men died throughout this and died in Valley Forge, not because of the weather, not because of the food or the water, but because of disease. And people, some of these men from different areas who were not exposed to these diseases had low immune systems for them, so they got sicker easier. So, some of the main things that went wrong in Valley Forge was just the start of it. From the start, they were set up for failure. They did not have a lot of help. They lacked many things. They were not equipped. They were not trained. They were weak. The weather was brutal. Disease was killing them. Um, and it is said that even at their good times, it was still bad. Even when the weather was slightly good, it was still brutal. So they never really had a chance to, they didn't get off to a good start. They weren't given a chance. But despite that all, they did persevere through it. Rather than leaving and giving up, they stayed. They fought through it. They came out stronger. They trained. And I read that a lot of what these men learned there is what is taught in our military now. So, although Valley Forge was a horrible time, it was not done in vain. One of the things I liked to do after reading about all this, I wanted to look up to see if there were any artifacts I could provide. It's hard to find artifacts, so I kind of just went through and got some images that I thought were cool. This right here is Isaac Potts' house, and this is the house that George Washington and his family stayed in and used as headquarters during this time. Like I said before, it is a big tourist attraction still, and this is just something I thought was cool to see. They allow people to come in and tour this. And then this was also cool. It's a replica of the huts that were built in Valley Forge for the soldiers and families to live in. As you can see, it was not huge. And I also thought it was just impressive that this was built like this from nothing when these men arrived. And then this was a more realistic photo, I thought, showed multiple huts here and in the cold weather like they lived through. And if you go to Valley Forge, you can see all of that. And then these were just some paintings that are very famous paintings. This is the most iconic painting of the March to Valley Forge. And it was of George Washington marching his troops there. And then this is Washington and Lafayette. And he was the man that showed up to help them. He trained these men and showed them how to fight, and that's why they came out stronger and fought stronger and won the battle after they left. And then this is a painting that depicts the men without shoes and bloody feet, like I had talked about. You can see here. And so that is something that is said a lot about Valley Forge, and they basically describe it as bloodied up bare feet. So I thought all that was cool. And there are a few fun facts that I learned throughout researching this, which they're not really fun. I mean, it was a horrible time, but Valley Forge today is known as Valley Forge National Historic Park, and it was the first state park in Pennsylvania. It says that it is thought that around 1/3 of the men arrived in Valley Forge with no shoes. And then it also talks about Martha Washington and says that she stayed at the camp as well, which we knew about, and she would bring baskets of food and socks to the soldiers who needed them the most. So I think it is safe to say that Washington and his wife, they were the ones that really fought for these men and fought to help them and fought for their survival. I am going to show a little clip of a video that I found online through history.com that I just thought was a good reenactment of this time, and I love watching reenactments, so I hope you enjoy it, and that will be the end of my video.
Like all generals, George Washington knew he would lose soldiers in battle. But during the infamous winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, some of Washington's men starved to death before his eyes. Others froze to death for want of an extra blanket. The death toll climbed at the rate of 10 men each day. Valley Forge became a high-stakes race against time, as Washington scrambled to provide for his soldiers before the next day exacted its 10 lives.
Washington comes in from the battles of Brandywine and Germantown with hundreds of wounded troops, some of whom are dying. At the same time, a typhus epidemic hits the area. There are no hospitals in Valley Forge.
Washington begs, borrows, buys, or commandeers what he needs. Eventually, he pulls together a primitive hospital system. But those lucky enough to avoid the hospital still face starvation.
Washington was told that the Army had 8 months' worth of food as he moved into Valley Forge. And when they checked the day that the Army arrived, it turned out to be 8 days' worth of food.
At Valley Forge, so many horses had died that men yoked themselves into wagons in order to move supplies. Washington pressed Congress for action. Unless some great change takes place, he warned, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse.
It's a letter in which there is no nuance. This is it. And he pushes everybody as hard as he can every single day to try and solve his problems, Band-Aid after Band-Aid, to try and get through the winter.
His efforts were all-consuming. In fact, Washington was the only officer who was always on the job. While others went home on furlough, Washington remained in camp with his men.
They see their captains, their majors, their colonels, and many of their generals begging for a chance to go home, begging for a chance to go back to their families, to be anywhere but at Valley Forge. There's one man who stays there with them, working and working and working to keep them alive, and that man is George Washington.